Hi, so I'm Rosina Plain, and today I just want to take you through this little gauge swatch that I've designed to go with my fairy dust cowl. So what you'll need when you're doing overlay mosaic crochet, because you're going to be cutting the yarn at the end of every row, you're definitely going to need a pair of scissors or yarn snips handy. And then your hook, that should be appropriate for whatever yarn you're using. So I recommend you use Stylecraft Special double knit in the pattern for fairy dust, and that recommends that you use a 4mm hook. Now I'm actually using a 3.75. The two are actually very similar in size, doesn't probably make a huge amount of difference, but for me, as I crochet on the average to slightly loose side, my go-to hook is my 3.75. But whatever hook you think that you would normally use for this yarn, that's a good place to start. For the purpose of the gauge swatch, our gauge swatch is going to be 21 stitches wide. So I've written the pattern for the gauge swatch to tell you to fasten off at the end of your chain, because if you did want to use it for like a mug rug or something and you weren't adding a border, you would then have like you'd have the little end at each end for like a fringe. But you can, what I'll probably do actually is do an extra chain, so we don't have to cut it at the end of the first chain. Okay, now the important thing, it is important to start with a chain rather than like a foundation double crochet or an I-cord, simply because we need a chain at each end of every single row, including the start chain, when we are adding our border at the end, because we're going to be working into those chains. All right, so start a chain. I don't usually start my chains with a slip knot. I will just twist the yarn, so you can see you've got like the loose end there. Just twist that yarn around my hook to start, and then work a chain, but don't pull this tight. If I pull that tight, that becomes a slip knot. But I'm going to leave it like that, nice and loose, just in case, especially when you're doing a longer chain, just in case you miscount at the end and you realise you need to work into it. So that's kind of going to be our knot stroke bonus chain if we need it. Okay, so I'm not counting that. We've now got to do 21 chains. Now you can add this gauge swatch to your main blanket if you want to make it a bit longer. And if you choose to start with that, you're going to need to start with 190, well, we'll have 197 stitches, okay, rather than 21. So you'll need to do a lot more. But for what I'm showing you here, I'm literally just going to show you the single repeat of 21 stitches. Okay, so to chain, like so. Okay, so don't pull this chain too tight. If you find you do chain really tightly, you might just want to go up a hook size just for this first bit, okay, just to make sure that your chain ends are kind of the same width as your normal stitches are. Okay, I've totally lost count there, so I'll have a little check out in a minute, but basically when you have done 21 chains, come back to me and we'll get started on the actual pattern. Okay, so I now have 21 chains, not including this initial loose one. Okay, now as I've said, if you're following the gauge swatch pattern, I've actually said to fasten off there and then start again. But what I'm going to do, because I'm not going to be using it for anything else, I'm just going to do one extra chain, which doesn't really count as a stitch. That is just a turning chain, yeah, to get our hook up to the right height for the next row. So for our first row, we are now going to twist the chain. So this is the chain at the front where you can see the two loops. If you turn it over, you'll see you've got an extra loop, like a bump at the back. Okay, so we are going to need to work into that for our main blanket, because we are going to need both of these loops when we make our border. Okay, so we skip this very first chain, and then we are going to work into that back bump there. And this is why you don't want your chain to be too tight. So if you did use a larger hook for your chain, you can now switch back to your other one. It was just literally to make sure that you can, you know, you've got a nice even, not too tight chain, and you can then get your hook into these back bumps. Okay, So we've got an edge stitch there. So we start with an edge stitch and then a chain. So every row on your blanket is going to start the same with a double crochet. Usually it'll be under both loops. This is just because we're into the starting chain, but you always start with a double crochet, then a chain, and you skip this chain. Okay, so when you work a chain, you miss the chain underneath, and then we are going to work double crochets into our back bump. So I'm going to do this until we've basically got like a couple of chains left at the end. For the purpose of the gauge swatch, you are going to need 17 double crochets now after this initial chain. Okay, so I've now got 3 there, so I'll carry on, do 14 more. Okay, so I've now got like 17 stitches after this initial chain space there. So now we're going to end our row with a chain, skip the next chain, and then you work into what will be basically the end chain. So you can see I got my stitch count correct, so I'm not needing to work into that. Now if you are making the blanket, which is like 197 stitches, you may just want to leave it just in case you've miscounted until you've worked like the first row of the pattern, so you know you're fine with your stitch count. Okay, so what we're going to do, as I said, we're going to miss this chain and we're going to work our final edge stitch into that last one there. Okay, and then we're going to fasten off. So to fasten off, you can work a chain, pull that up. You'll want to leave, certainly when you're doing the blanket, just in case you've made any mistakes, and because we're going to have to tie off the ends at the end, I would say you want to leave at least sort of 10 centimeters, 4 inches there. Cut that off, pull that out, and then you can pull that tight, and that has now completed our row 1 of our gauge swatch. Now if you're making the blanket, I actually start with the foundation row, so this would then be your foundation row in the blanket. The reason for that is just if we now started our border straight into there, that can be quite close to the first row of pattern stitches, so I personally like to have an extra row at the start and the end of my blankets, just to give it a little bit more breathing space between the pattern and the border. So it's entirely up to you, but say for the gauge swatch, that's round 1 we've done. And if you're making the blanket, that would be your foundation row. Okay, so now we are for row 2 going to switch to our contrast colour. So that's my magenta here. So for this we do start with a slip knot. Now I don't necessarily do what's technically a slip knot, but if you remember, but it works in the same way. If you remember what I did when I started the chain, where I just twisted that round and pulled a loop through, well this time we're going to tighten it and that becomes a slip knot. Okay, so it's nice and secure, a nice secure knot, and then every row will start the same. We are going to start under both loops, so this is just the first and last stitch. You work your double crochets under both loops, so we're going to do a standing double crochet in there, okay, and a chain, and then we skip this chain here. Okay, so that's how you're going to start every single row. And now, because this is our first row in our contrast, it's nice and easy. We're just going to be working double crochets, but if you can see there, just into the back loops. Okay, so not under both loops, not like that. We're just going to be working into that back loop. Okay, all the way along. So there will now be 17 back loop double crochets if you're doing the gauge swatch, which will take you up to that chain at the end. Okay, so carry on along, come back to me when you get to that point. So we've got 16, 17 stitches. That now takes us up to our final chain. So 1 chain, skip that chain, and double crochet under both loops at the end there. Fasten off. Okay, so every row will end the same as well. Now what you probably want to do, again, similar to what I said for the working into the chain, you don't really want your chains at each end to be too tight either. Okay, so just try again. If you do tend to chain quite tight, just try to loosen them off ever so slightly. You'll just find it a lot easier to work into those chains if you do that. Okay, so far so simple. That is our first 2 rows done. So now we go back to our main colour for row 3. We're going to start with a slip knot on our hook again. Okay, so as always we are going to start with double crochet under both loops and a chain, skip the chain. So now we instantly start with a new stitch, which in the written instructions, because I know I use my universal terms, so rather than needing a separate UK and US version of every part of the curl, I call my stitches an F for front loop treble or front loop double crochet if you're doing US, and B for back loop double crochet or back loop single crochet for US. Okay, so we're starting our pattern here with an F. So to do that, we're not going to be working into this row of stitches we've been in the back loop. We're going to drop down a row and we are going to work into this front loop that we didn't use before there. Okay, and work your treble in there. Now that treble, if you notice, if you're following the written instructions, is before the asterisk. If you're looking at the chart, it's before the solid line. Or actually for the first 5 rows of this chart, there's a dotted line, but it's the dark line there. I just put a dotted line for the first few rows and the last few rows because you'll only be working them at the start and the end. Chunk in the middle in a solid box gets repeated however many times you want to repeat it. We're just doing one for the gauge swatch, but you could just keep repeating it to make anything you wanted really. Okay, so that front loop treble is before our repeat starts, and then our repeat starts with 3 more. So 1, 2, 3. So what you'll notice is that is leaving a little sort of pocket at the back. That is perfectly normal. That's what's meant to happen. I know some people don't like them, and there are various ways you can get rid of them or do like a reversible pattern. I personally don't like using any of those. I find they slow me down, and most of them will also scrunch up the pattern a bit. But if you want to look at that, by all means look into that separately. You might also need more yarn if you choose to do any of the things that join that up. So, but anyway, for the purpose of my pattern, I'm quite happy with the little pockets. Okay, so we've now got our 3 trebles at the start of our repeat. So now we need to do a back loop double crochet. You need to make sure you're making that into the right place. So if we hold that nice and flat, you should see if we were doing another treble, we'd be working into this loop, and then immediately above that is the stitch we've got to make sure we do our double crochet in. And if you now look at the back, you can also, if I take that hook out, you'll be able to see we have missed. So this is the chain we missed. This is the stitch we missed behind our first front loop treble before the repeat started, and this is the next 3. So if you count along, you'll know that you're now in the right place. So you always need to miss the stitches behind each treble. Okay, right, so now we complete our repeat with 4 front loop trebles. Okay, so we haven't worked the treble into the one where we had the double crochet behind it. 2, whoops, 3, 4. So that is our repeat. Okay, now another little tip, I mean, you see just slightly that's pulling up, that will settle down. If you find that you are getting quite big loops at the bottom of your stitches, your front loop stitches, what you need to do, a couple of little tips I've got for you. One is to make sure you keep your top loops of your stitches nice and even and not too big. So if you tend to have big loops on the top, just make sure when you start to make your stitch, you just tension that a little bit more. Okay, So we're now going to start the repeat again with 3 more front loop trebles. So just make sure, like I said, this top loop here isn't too big. And then the other thing you'll probably want to do is make sure that the rest of your stitch isn't too tight. So what you don't want to do is bunch that up really tightly, because that will then put extra pressure on it. Just try and keep a nice even tension, okay? Like so. So this one not too loose and the rest not too tight. And that should minimize any little loops that you find when you're working into those front loops. Okay, so that's now 3. So what we should now have is a little run of 7. There we are, we've got 7 trebles there. And then we've got, so that was 4 at the end of the first repeat, 3 at the start of the next, 1 double crochet, and then we're going to complete, oh hold on, need some more yarn. We're going to complete this repeat with 3 more trebles into that front loop. Okay, 4 rather, 3, 4, and my yarn is all going funny again, bear with me. Okay, so we've ended our repeat there with the 4 trebles, and that has now taken us up to this chain at the end of the row. So 1 chain, skip that chain, and double crochet under both loops at the end, fasten off. Okay, so that's that. So now we have got to the right place. We know we've got the right number of stitches, so we can now tighten this first one up. Okay, so that is now row 3 done. Okay, so row 4 is actually another nice easy one. Slip knot on the hook, edge stitch under both loops, chain, and we're just going to do exactly the same as we did on row 2, and we're just going to do a row of back loop double crochets. Okay, so do that, and remember at the end you're going to finish with a chain and a double crochet under both loops, and then come back and we'll do row 5 together. Okay, so I've now got started on row 5 with my edge stitch and the chain. Okay, and then we've got, just like we did on row 3, we're going to be starting with a front loop treble again. Okay, so that's before our repeat starts. Now our repeat starts with, well, we've got, if you're looking at the written instructions, you'll see some square brackets. So in my patterns, when I put anything in square brackets, you need to take whatever is inside those brackets and do it the number of times it tells you to immediately after the brackets. Okay, so what that is saying is we've got to do 1 front loop treble, 1 back loop double crochet, and we've got to do that 3 times. So that's 2 and 3. Okay, and then our repeat ends with 2 more front loop double crochets, front loop trebles. Okay, so that is your repeat. Okay, so we're going to start the next repeat with 1 front loop treble, 1 back loop double crochet, and do that 3 times. So 2 and 3, and then our repeat finishes with 2 front loop trebles again. Okay. And then that takes us up to our chain at the end, where we're going to do 1 chain, skip that chain, and a double crochet under both loops for our last edge stitch. Okay, and then fasten off. So that's row 5. So for row 6, we're now going back to our contrast colour. edge stitch, chain. Now we have 1 back loop double crochet before we start our repeat. Our repeat is now 3 double crochets, so obviously they're always going to be into the back loops there. 3, 1 front loop treble. Okay, and then we end our repeat with 4 back loop double crochets. 3, 4, and then the next repeat starts with 3 back loop double crochets, 2, 3, 1 front loop treble, and we finish off with 3 back loop double crochets. Okay. Chain and edge stitch. So say every row is going to start and end the same, and we're alternating colours. Okay. So row 7, start with our slip knot on a hook as always, edge stitch, chain, then we've got 1 back loop double crochet to start, then 1 front loop treble. Okay, you can see where that is. 5 back loop double crochets, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1 front loop treble, and then we end our repeat with a back loop double crochet. So then we're starting again, front loop treble, 5 back loop double crochets, 3, 4, 5, 1 treble, 1 double, which takes us to the end where we've got a chain and then our double crochet under both loops. Okay. So you probably know enough now to carry on. Like I say, I'll just come back every few rows and just show you what it's meant to look like, and then I'll come back at the end and explain how we measure it to check our gauge. Okay, so I've now just done row 17, and I just wanted to come back and show you, I mean, for the gauge swatch, we're now just going to do an extra sort of, I think, 5 rows to complete the pattern, sort of even it up. If you wanted to repeat this pattern over and over again to make, I don't know, a cushion or a blanket or something, you absolutely can. And what you'll then be doing is you'll now, before you do row 18, you'll then repeat rows 6 to 17, however many times you want. So what you'll then have is you'll have alternating rows of the little sort of the crosses with the little sparkly bits around, and then just the crosses in between. So that was what would happen there if you wanted to do that. But I say I'm now going to carry on with row 18 up until, what is it, row 23, I think, to finish it off. Okay, so I have now completed my gauge swatch here. Now, as you're making a blanket, the gauge isn't absolutely essential. Now, if your gauge swatch is a little bit smaller than mine, then your blanket will just be a little bit smaller. If your gauge swatch is a bit larger, then so will your blanket be. Now, the only thing you need to bear in mind there is if you are using one of the colour packs and your gauge comes out larger than mine, you may have issues with not having enough yarn. So just bear that in mind. So try to keep it sort of my size or maybe fractionally smaller. Okay, so to measure it, I've got my ruler, and I'm not messing around with saying so many stitches in a row, so 10 centimeters, because I know that can cause some confusion. So what we're actually going to do is just literally measure this swatch from side to side, top to bottom. Okay, so if you look there, you can see it's 10.5 centimeters wide. So this is obviously for the one doing the double DK, the special DK yarn. If you were using the Impressions and Bellissima version, then yours will be a little bit bigger than this, but so that's 10.5 there. And we now just measure this way. You can see 12.5 hopefully. Okay, so that's the size of my swatch, and like I said, just bear in mind that if yours is a little bit bigger, you may need a bit more yarn.